Welcome to the Rooted Healing podcast, where we seek to deepen our kinship with the living world and with the great mystery that runs through us. This is a space where stories heal with words that weave us closer to our wild and daring natures, bringing together the expansive minds, topics, and ideas that help us heal, reimagine, and co-create the world we wish to thrive in.
The most human need that we all have as humans is to belong. We have to belong. One of the things that working with sound does, it dissolves the boundaries. So if you have a group of people chanting together, you dissolve the boundaries between them and you create very quickly a community of people. And this is the most magical thing, well, one of the most magical things that happens when you chant together in a group, is that you create a sonorous community.
Jill Purce is a renowned voice teacher, family constellations therapist, and author who pioneered the international sound healing movement through her rediscovery of ancient vocal techniques, the teaching of overtone chanting, the power of group chant, and the spiritual potential of the voice as a magic instrument for healing and meditation. She developed the practice of healing family and ancestral traumas with her family constellations work and the activation of the mandala as a living practice with her extended mandala ceremonies. Her 1974 book, The Mystic Spiral: Journey of the Soul, was a seminal influence, helping inspire the birth of the modern labyrinth movement. The BBC made an hour-long documentary film about Jill and her work called More Ways Than One, The Mystic Spiral, and she produced over 30 books as a general editor of the Thames and Hudson Art and Imagination series, which pioneered a thematic approach to the spiritual and psychological meanings of the art of different cultures. Jill lives in London with her husband, Rupert Sheldrake, and their two sons, Cosmo and Merlin. Rupert is a biologist, best known for his hypothesis of morphic resonance, which I've been studying. Merlin is also a biologist with his book Entangled Life: How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures, which has revolutionized our mainstream understanding of the fungi world. Cosmo is also a professional musician, composer, and multi-instrumentalist whose music I've loved for years now. So I find the Sheldrakes to be one of those truly eccentric, wonderful wizarding families who could waltz right into or out of J.K. Rowling's wizarding world. So it was an honour to have Jill spare some time for this episode where she shares some golden nuggets of wisdom on all these themes. You can learn more about Jill's work at jillpurce.com, where you can also sign up to her first in-person immersion since the pandemic, which is happening this autumn in London. At Rooted Healing, we have a few spaces left on our October ceremonial psilocybin retreat in the Netherlands. Head to rootedhealing.org/earthmedicine to learn more. And you can also join us at Forestlings in Britain, where we are gathering to honour the turn of the season and that time when our fungi friends flourish. We will journey through practices inspired by mycelial intelligence to celebrate our interconnectedness with all that surrounds us. Head to rootedhealing.org/forestlings to learn more. Okay, enjoy this episode with Jill Purce. I kind of want to throw us in at the deep end and start right at the beginning of existence itself and how this relates to sound and resonance in your work and that sort of primordial journey of sound, how this, especially the voice, is such a powerful practice to really connect with that primordial wisdom.
All you can really say about the world nowadays is that it's resonant. It's regularities and periodicities of vibratory movement. And the more we discover, the more this becomes completely fundamental to our understanding of almost everything. resonance is at the bottom, at the base of everything, really, and that becomes more and more. So it's very interesting to compare the stories, the mythologies, and of different cultures with the development of modern science. And this is something I've always been interested in, because I think that you find the stories hold the real essence of what science is discovering. And so because everything is resonant, and we as human beings need to participate in the nature of things, the way that we can do that is through our voices. We're a wind instrument, we're a tube with holes in us, and how we participate in the resonant nature of it all is through sound. And culturally, this is very interesting, because we tended to have gone silent over the years. Traditionally, everybody sang, and it didn't really matter, whether you sang in tune or not. And then gradually, as musical notation developed, and as professionalism developed, because really only the professionals can read music. And the thing about musical literacy is that you can capture things that are composed once and then recreate them, or, as I like to say, the word in the game is execute them, which says everything really. So increasingly, people have felt somehow not belonging to this resonant world, because it's a world for professionals, and they feel that their voices is good enough. And so they sort of load it up into some kind of a device and put earphones on, and then feed it back into themselves, instead of allowing it to come out of themselves into the world, which is how it ought to be, and to participate in the resonant nature of it all. And that's really what I've done. This is what I realized when I started, which is an embarrassingly long time ago. I realized, in the 70s, I realized that we'd gone silent. That if you wanted to sing, at that time, in order to join a choir, you had to read music, you had to have an audition, and you had to sing in tune. Nowadays, everything's changed. Nowadays, there are community choirs where you don't need to sing in tune, have an audition, and you don't need to read music. And in fact, one of my son's wives' mothers started a wonderful choir in Vancouver and Victoria called Getting Higher Choir, which I think is the most glorious title and says it all, really. And so this is what I started to do, was to gather people together in such a way that I could teach them something that they could actually use their voices, even if they'd been told to stand at the back and mouth it, from childhood onwards, which is one of the awful things that people get told and wounds them and damages them psychologically forever. So whatever anybody had been told, to gather people together to use their voices. And when I did this, my big question really was, if we're going to sing again, what are we going to sing? And so if we sing with words, there's a real problem with this, because the whole point of what I was trying to do was to use sound as a practice, as a meditation, to be present in the moment. So most of our life we spend dreading the past, or rather regretting the past, and therefore dreading the future, because we have to do what we forgot to do yesterday. And this excludes us from the present. And all spiritual traditions tell us that the most important thing is being in the present. So how can we be in the present? So this is why I started doing what I'm doing, because to be in the present, when you're chanting, you can only chant in the present, but you can still chant in the present and have ideas and things and make shopping lists. But if you listen to yourself chanting while you're chanting, you're creating a circuit of attention, and then you can only be in the present as long as you listen. And so this is what I began to do. And so I was thinking, well, what kind of if we're going to sing again, what are we going to sing? Words are a problem because they're in a discursive modality, which means they're in time. So again, it's past, now, and it's future. And so I wanted something which was timeless. And the thing about chanting as a spiritual activity is it corrals the mind. It contains the mind in the present. And so I wanted a way of chanting which could also be in tune. So one of the things that happened in the West in the 17th century with the popularity of keyboard instruments, clavichords and eventually pianos and so forth, is that they have a kind of fixed tuning. And if you have a fixed tuning, you can't tune in the way that people have traditionally tuned, which is by going from one note to the fifth above that, the fifth note above, and the fifth note above that, fifth note above that, so dum, dum, and so forth. Because when you get to the point where you would be the octave above, you are actually overlapping it by a quarter semitone, which is called the Pythagorean comma. And this is a problem when you have fixed tuning. And so with fixed tuning, they had to find some way of overcoming this problem. And so what happened was the quarter of a semitone was, well, the first they experimented with all kinds of ways. And then finally, this quarter of a semitone was put into the octave. And that meant that all the intervals in the octave were made a little bit bigger or smaller than they should be to be in tune, which means that everything became out of tune. And so this was a kind of pact with the devil. It was a kind of bargain. We'll make all our music out of tune, and now look what we can do with it. And what we could do with it was what everybody since Bach, because he was the first person to really play around with this, could do, was all music since Bach has been out of tune, but not out of tune so as you would notice, just a little bit. So you have to have perfect pitch to notice. Most people don't notice. But when I was asking the question, what are we going to sing? Obviously it can't be words, because if you sing words one side of the border, you're singing the right tune. If you step over the border and you're singing a national anthem, it's the wrong tune, as well as being in time. So what I found was this form of chanting found, it's found, a form of it is found in Central Asia amongst Tibetans, Mongolians, Tuvans, but the form I teach is really non-cultural. And it's a form of chanting where you chant on a single note, but by changing the shape of the resonant cavity, which we do when we speak, you're able to amplify the internal constituent notes of the sound so that you hear them louder than the fundamental. And this has many names. It's called overtone chanting because you're making sounds over the tone. It's called harmonic chanting because the notes that you're creating or making louder are always in a harmonic relationship to the note you start on. It's called partials because it's part of the note. So it has many different names. But this form of chanting is a glorious thing to do. It means that you sing on one note, which everyone can do. It means that you're really being in tune, and which you can't do with normal music. And it also means, because every form has its own sound, and so the sound of the thing is a key to its own dissolution. Hence, if you wind a wet finger around a wine glass, the wine glass, if it's good enough quality, accurate enough voice, it breaks. And so one of the things that working with sound does, it dissolves the boundaries. So if you have a group of people chanting together, you dissolve the boundaries between them and you create very quickly a community of people. And this is the most magical thing, well, one of the most magical things that happens when you chant together in a group, is that you create a sonorous community. And really that's been my aim, is to create a sonorous community where we can be in the present. So it's a very powerful meditation. It's one of the most powerful meditations there is, especially this form of overtone chanting, because it embodies all the kind of things that you need when you're learning to meditate in a very profound way.
Wow, yeah. That was a wonderful journey through all of that. And I am utterly intrigued by this overtone chanting. I've been having a go with it in my own time, but I would love to experience it in a group setting. I can only imagine how powerful it is. And like you say, this sort of present circuit that it brings you into, and the notion of unraveling language or not even adhering to language, because that already creates so many confinements and structures that we're trying to kind of get out of to actually truly be present. Reminds me of the Voice of Knowledge, that book, sort of saying, how do we stop naming things that we see? And I know you've written about that.
Yes, I mean, when we name things, we separate one thing from another. And, all spiritual traditions show us that there's no separation. So if I see you as separate from me, it leads me either to want more of you than I can have, leading to attachment, or being lumbered with you and not wanting, leading to anger, aversion, all based on ignorance, which is ignoring which is that there is no separation. So we know there's no separation, but we act in this world, as if there is, and that separation gives rise to language, discursivity, polarity. Everything that we work with in this world is based on separation, but the spiritual path tells us there is no separation, and so all spiritual traditions, all spiritual practices are some way or other of going beyond the separation, and the sound is absolutely it's the easiest way of doing something which is not easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of when we look at the nature of consciousness itself, which I feel your whole family are such pioneers with. In terms of our healing, finding this lost voice, because I'm someone who's had, for example, quite a lot of theatre training and being taught to sing a certain way. And like you mentioned earlier, this sort of early school choir where perhaps you're told not to sing that note, whatever. It's huge, isn't it? It is our expression, it's our resonance. So, what is the healing that you witness helping people find that lost voice?
Well, I mean, as you say, I mean, actors are trained to produce voice in a particular way. Singers are taught to produce sounds as based on their own cultural heritage. So in the West, classical singers sing bel canto, where you produce a certain kind of vibrato, which vibrato is very interesting. Actually, I have a theory about vibrato. Nobody really understands why vibrato exists, but I think I know why it exists. Because vibrato, you're very slightly changing the pitch up and down, and one of the most characteristic things in sound is called the attack. It's the beginning of a sound where you go from silence into sound, and the reason it captures you most completely is because there's the most amount of information in it, acoustically speaking. So if you're constantly changing the pitch, you're repeating this attack, which means that your ear is engaged continuously, or repeatedly rather. And this is necessary, if you have a singer singing above an orchestra playing full blast, 100-piece orchestra playing, at total volume, and the solo singer has to be heard above that. This is one of the mysteries of singing. If you're singing with vibrato, you have this repeated attack, which means that the ear can engage with it in a way that it couldn't otherwise. So that's my theory about it. So I think it's so important to use our voices. It's one of the best ways of really being joyful. It's a very joyful thing. It's very hard to be sad if you're singing. Even lullabies. Sometimes there's a wonderful essay by Lorca who is describing how lullabies are often about the most ghastly things of death and so forth, and yet they're magical and inspiring, and it's a wonderful thing. You mentioned my family. Yeah, my family, we're all very busy. My husband Rupert Sheldrake, as you know, is a brilliant scientist and has long had very alternative theories to the current ones, which I think, if they're not recognized in his lifetime, they certainly will be afterwards, but they make sense of so much. And then Merlin, my eldest son, has written this wonderful book, Entangled Life, which is brilliantly written. I'm just so proud of him. It's punny, it's brilliant, it's informative about the whole mycelial universe. And Cosmo, my younger son, is an extraordinary musician who uses the sounds of species which are endangered, birds and fish and so on, in his music in a wonderful way. So yeah, we're all at it, all of us, in our own way, and there's a lot of similarity. I mean, Cosmo, mine is about the voice, and Cosmo is a musician, and Rupert's a scientist. Merlin is a biologist, like Rupert. So, but they're both musicians, and yeah. So it somehow has, they've run with what we do, and are doing it in their own way, which is quite wonderful. Because it could happen the other way. A lot of people who are doing things have children who become kind of materialistic and bankers and lawyers and things. And whereas, I'm very pleased to say that both of ours are going out on a limb and really trying to change the world in very positive ways, and our ways of perceiving the world.
Yeah, I'd say you're one of the families. I don't know many families who I individually have found all of you from my different interests and aspects. So yeah, I've been listening to Cosmo's music for years. I'm a big fan of Merlin's book. I'm studying and reading a lot of Rupert's work because I'm studying with the Aleph Trust. So I'm studying consciousness and transpersonal psychology. And I've been following your work for years as well. So yeah, you're probably one of those few families where somehow I keep being led.
Right.
But it's just, yeah, it's wonderful. And also just beautifully original and radical, the work you're all doing. I think it's so needed, and it gives me faith in our direction in general, because you've spoken about how the voice acts as this intermediary between the subtle realm of mind and the more physical realm of body, as taught in Tibetan tradition. And I'm trying to get my head around this because it makes so much sense to me, but I just love for you to speak a little bit more about it.
In traditional cultures, people praise the divine in whatever form they feel the divine to be, and they praise it usually through chanting, and in fact, and singing. And in fact, in the Bible, I think there are over 200 uses of the words praise and sing unto the Lord. It's very interesting. So in traditional cultures, people have felt the need to praise this sense of the divine being in order, well, first of all, to praise, you're great, you're good, blah, blah, blah. And then petition, please help my children pass their exams, or bring the rains, or heal so-and-so. And then on a more sophisticated level, participation. I call these the 3 Ps: praise, petition, and participation. And so participation is not seeing this divine being as separate, to whom you petition and ask favors, but you become one with. This is why I call it, say it's a more sophisticated level where you become one with the divine. But this notion of a divine being, or the voice being the intermediary between spirit and matter is a very, very interesting one. And also it overcomes the separation of quality and quantity, which is related, because the continuity of musical timing. So if I interrupt the continuity of your experience, if I go like that, if I make a sound, then if I speed that up, we have rhythm. If I speed it up beyond 16 cycles per second, it turns into a note. And if it's faster, it becomes the harmonics. And if it's slower, like now, 20 minutes later or an hour later, depending on the composer, Stockhausen, Wagner, whatever, we have duration. So all music is based on counting, which is the purely quantitative act, if you like. However, what emerges from that counting is pure quality. It's something you can't describe, or it's qualia. It's something very mysterious. So music is both, and this is completely unique. I don't think there's anything else which is both based on separation, on counting, on repetition, and at the same time is based on qualia and quality, and this ephemeral essence which you can only feel, if you like. And so sound, in a sense, comes in between the quantitative physical universe and the qualitative spiritual universe. And so the Tibetans talk about body, speech, or voice, and mind. So again, the voice or speech or sound is that which comes between the physical and the spiritual. And then you get this in so many different traditions. For example, in one of the stories in the Hindu tradition concerns Shiva. So normally Shiva is the destroyer, but he also has a role as the creator when he dances. So the story around him is that he's asleep. Then he wakes up, and then he starts to dance. And when he dances, he holds in one hand a flame and the other hand a damaru, a double-sided drum. And as he dances, the world awakens. And out of his drum fall the letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, which is creation through language. And where these letters fall is onto the luminous spiritual petals around the chakras or centers of subtle energies along the spine of each one of us. So they become the mantric letters which allow us having been created through language, to return spirit of matter back into spirit. So in many traditions, you have this idea of the descent of matter into spirit through sound, and our job, which is to return matter back into spirit again through sound, through magic sound. So this is an example of this sort of cyclic, or the continuity of the descent of spirit into matter, and then our job, which is to return matter back into spirit. So you have this in many, many different traditions, this idea. And then in the Christian tradition, in the beginning was the word, the logos, which is the sound, of course, the breath. And then in the Dogon tradition, you have the creation as the 7 vibrations of Ogatameli, or in the Hindu, another version of the Hindu tradition, the mantra, the sound before the sound before the sound, which is the Om. So you have, in so many different traditions, you have this idea of the spiritual world coming into the physical world through sound, and then the human job is to return it. And again, you get this in the Neoplatonic tradition, where a little bit of soul substance comes down through the great chain of being, through the planetary spheres into the cherubim, seraphim, planetary spheres, into the elements, and finally into us. And then at the moment of death, you see these images on sarcophagi of bird-like creatures. They're the sirens, who hold a soul, a little baby in their arms, and this is the soul that they return through the spheres to the divine. And you see these in sort of classical paintings, where you see angels, and angels have their mouths open. And the reason that angels have their mouths open is because they come in choirs. So they have wings. So they represent the resonant realms, the sonorous resonant realms between us and heaven. Wings shows that they belong to this realm of spirit, of air, and mouths open singing because they're resonant. They're the resonant realms. So again, these are the intermediaries. So sound is the intermediary, and you find this, it's the first thing that comes when a child is born, is sound in the womb. The child hears sound in the womb, and it's the last sense to go at death as well. So it's definitely the intermediary between the worlds.
Yeah, I love that. I've personally been on such a journey with using my voice, especially in ceremonial contexts. That's something I really love with the morphic resonance theory that Rupert's come up with, the idea of these blueprint of ceremony and ritual, and how we can fit into this timeless repetition of human participation and using the voice and connecting with spirit. I just feel like it's one of the few things that really explains that sense of being in ceremony and feeling like you've been there many, many, many times before.
And I use ceremony a lot. I mean, Rupert's been very influenced. We've both been very influenced by each other. And in his talk about sound and voice and ceremony, he's been very influenced by me. And so I use ceremony a lot. I do these very extended, until COVID, I did these very extended mandala ceremonies, where I transformed the mandala into the human, the group into the mandala, and transformed it through continuous chant for 7 days. And the importance of ceremony, one of the things about ceremony is, when people come and work with me, they come because they have a sense they could learn something which would make them better human beings. That's why anybody goes anywhere to do anything, to learn anything, whether it's to become more developed, more conscious, more kinder, or whatever it is. They have a sense that they're going to improve in some way. But then they go home, and then their societal, human, familial context has no idea they've changed. And so they kind of glob around them in the kind of jigsaw puzzle-ish shape that contains them. And then, of course, they can't be anything other than what they used to be. But if you work ceremonially, then you have the witness. So you have people who are witnessing you undergoing the change. And then they know that you know that they know that you know that they know. There's no going back. And so the power of the witness is absolutely essential. And one of my students discovered this wonderful paper. He's been working with me for years, and he found this paper which was about what makes for longevity in a marriage. So they is it the size of the cake? How long did the parents know each other? Did they have a big honeymoon? How much money they spent on the wedding? On the rest, blah blah blah. And the only thing which had a correlation between the longevity of the marriage was how many people were invited. In other words, and attended. In other words, how many witnesses they were to the couple going from being unmarried to being married. So you need, when you have witnesses and in a wedding, you sign a document saying I was here and I saw and they're now married. So the idea of the witness is absolutely key, because when you're married, you're going from being unmarried to being married, and it's really a tricky kind of thing to do, and you need all the help you can get. And so the more witnesses you have, the more people who know that you're now not any longer unmarried, but you're married, the more help you get. And so this is really the function of ceremony, is to embed your transformation into a societal context so that there is no going back to what you were before.
Yeah, that's beautifully put. I hadn't thought about it like that at all. And yeah, that makes so much sense. Your journey with sound and resonance, it sounded like it almost began with form and deeply observing form within nature. And you've written this book about the mystical spiral and gone so deep down the philosophy of the spiral and what it means. And I know that you also inspired the installation of the labyrinth in San Francisco's Grace Cathedral.
The spiral, I mean, I started this many years ago, actually. Let's see, I think even the late 60s probably. I was at university, and I had to do I did fine art at university, and it was a 4-year course, and it was actually practical, but at the same time we did art history, and I had to write a thesis, and I just thought it was completely pointless to writing about somebody's ideas about somebody's ideas about somebody's art. I couldn't see any point in that, and so I decided that I became very aware of the spiral as a kind of theme, which cut across all the kind of boundaries of any disciplines. It's completely cross-disciplinary. Whereas it was a representation of growth in nature. It was a record of its own. Shells are a record of their growth in nature in time. So the spiral is a record of growth in time, and you see that in shells and ammonites and so forth. With an ammonite, it keeps growing and leaving a sort of a little door behind it as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's a very useful mathematical formula in growth. But it's also the sort of mandalic journey of the soul towards the center, towards stillness, which is what happens with sound and mantra, of course, which corrals the mind. It's repetitious. It doesn't, Western music starts here and goes there. And usually it has a dance, it has a time signature, which is based on dance. So it moves in time. Whereas mantra is repeated, and the whole point of mantra is, and it doesn't have any meaning. I mean, each word can have a meaning, but there's no discursive sentence. There may be a accumulation of words, and usually the mantras are made up of several words, but very often they don't mean anything as a sentence. Each word might have an induction of order or development of consciousness, or have a meaning in itself, but the whole sentence that's not the point of it. The point is that it's done in a way that it stops the mind from moving on. It corrals the mind into the center. And so the spiral, in a way, it shows psychologically, it shows the development of consciousness. You have the verticalization of your birthday is like the verticalization of your self through time, cutting through the spirals. And so I wrote my thesis on the spiral, and then I wrote the book, The Mystic Spiral, which is showing how shows both the journey of the soul, this pilgrimage, if you like, where you're going around the same place, but you're always on a different level. And at the same time, it's this journey of the subtle energy, the Kundalini within the body, and it embodies and it takes us so many different directions, as an illustration, and the labyrinth is one example is basically, if you unravel it, it's basically a spiral journey to the center, a contemplative journey to the center, and then you can't remain in the center. You have to return to everyday life, but you're no longer the same. So once you've arrived in the center, and then you come back, you're totally transformed by your journey. And yes, the person who made the labyrinth, very popular again in Grace Cathedral and so on, had read my book, and I have a whole section on the labyrinth, and I've done many labyrinth ceremonies as well. It's the traditional labyrinth is very interesting because it's you can actually take it apart. There are two lines: the traditional labyrinth, what's called the Cretan labyrinth, and you get the two halves of the brain. And I did a whole ceremony with the men coming in with one rope and the women with another, and laying them and doing so forth. So so the spiral is a completely cross-disciplinary representation, and then you have the sort of whirls of the galaxies and the spiral galaxies, and the whirls of the hair and the fingernails. I mean, there's so much in nature which is spiralic, and so much in all sort of mythological representations of the journey. So it's such a rich and tradition. I mean, I was always going to write a much bigger book, with the whole sort of natural world in it as well as the spiritual world. But life took over, and then I started working with sound. Then I started with family constellations, which I should perhaps talk a little bit about as well. And so I never got around to writing. I should have written hundreds of books, but I find doing things is much more fun.
Yeah, I would love for you to talk about the family constellation work and the ancestral healing work. And I know that you also bridge that into its own form of ceremony with overtone chanting. I mean, I really, really keen to make it to an in-person one day. So yeah, please do tell me about this work.
Well, I'm doing my first in-person workshop here in England since COVID, and on the 28th of October over All Souls. So this work is fascinating. I began because I started as part of my voice workshop, having people honor their ancestors sonorously, and the effect was so dramatic that it led me into working much more individually. So the work is really about the field of our family and ancestors. And when anybody in previous generations, whether if their life has been interrupted by early deaths, suicides, murders, accidents, incarcerations, injustices, emigrations, anything considered societally inappropriate at the time, nothing now, but there was things were illegitimacy, any interruptions, abortions, addictions, giving up children for adoption, so anything which has happened. Of course, these things have happened in all of our families. And so whenever those things have happened in previous generations, the trauma of that event is somehow captured rather in the family and ancestral field, and is highly conservative. And so you get every generation, you find people who are following the earlier trauma, and it can be quite literally. I mean, they can actually follow it, and the pattern can be very, very similar indeed, or it can be some kind of exclusion from the field. So we have a tendency, for example, if somebody has abused us, the tendency is to cut them off and consider them beyond the pale. But then what happens if we do that is we punish ourselves because we feel guilty, and that person, obviously a powerful person, is out there making trouble. And the most human need that we all have as humans is to belong. We have to belong. This is completely fundamental. And so how we belong is by becoming part of the field. And if we are sent out beyond the pale, then we're out there making trouble. We don't belong. So in this work, I have, instead of people cutting the ties with people who've become problematic for them, I have them integrate them. So I would have them honor them. We have talk about forgiveness. Forgiveness is very tricky, because if you forgive somebody, you put yourself above them inevitably, and you're so grand that you can actually forgive this person down there. Whereas if you honor them, you're elevating them above yourself, and you're putting yourself down, and that is much more powerful. And so the work is really about, well, first of all, how it works is absolutely baffling, is that people doing the work choose people from the group, or I'm doing it online at the moment from the windows, to represent their family members. So if I say to you, I'd like you to be my mother, her name is Eleanor, then you immediately become my mother in a completely mysterious way. And I saw this at work when my first time Cosmo, my musician son, many years ago, he was a representative in the group. And I had these two people who'd worked with me a lot, two brothers. One was a musician doing his PhD at Cambridge in music, and one was his slightly vulnerable brother, and they were both in the workshop. And the musician chose Cosmo to represent his brother who was there. And I saw my son Cosmo, who's very clever and rational and fun and easygoing, and and I saw him the moment he was chosen kind of collapse on himself. And then I could see, I knew him, he's my son. I could see him saying internally, "This is ridiculous, I'm Cosmo." And then collapsing. And then, "This is ridiculous, I'm Cosmo." Collapsing. So he was going between being claimed as this person somehow, some mysteriously, and his rational mind kicking in and saying, "No, this can't be true, I'm Cosmo." And then finally he let go and became this person, and he was being watched by the person he was representing. It was very amazing. So this is what happens. People find themselves becoming other people, and their rational mind usually says, "Oh, wait a minute, this can't," until they get it. And if people who've worked with me a lot know to let go and not fight it. So other people, so you have these naive representatives becoming other members of the family. And then in real life, the person working sort of shuffles them into a tableau to represent in a timeless way their family relations, or on screen in Zoom, which I'm doing at the moment, I have little figures, and I have a window of these figures on a kind of plate, and they move them so that you can see the family from above, which is actually even clearer than in real life. And I do it ceremonially, so I can turn everything, and we chant in between each person to amplify the family and ancestral field. It's very shamanic. And then somehow I have people just say very briefly what the interruptions were with this person, with each person, only the facts. And then I have a way, I mean, it's in my gift, I suppose, of seeing or perceiving what has happened in previous generations that is affecting them currently. And we're able in the present, by means of these representatives, to do and say and transform what happened or didn't happen in the past in such a way that we're no longer entangled with this earlier person because it's been resolved. And so the issue, which has been going down from generation to generation, no longer continues to go down. We no longer have to pass it on to our descendants, direct or indirect. So, and we no longer find that it's blocking our own lives. It's utterly astonishing. It's so powerful. And in one session, people's lives are changed, something that could take, all their life of talking therapy. Talking therapy is on the level of the rational mind in general. It's on the surface. Anything you can talk about discursively has to be up in the conscious world. Most of our problems are deep in the unconscious. And while, talking therapy accesses the unconscious through dreams and so forth, this way drills down into the unconscious immediately. And you see these patterns coming down through the generations in this utterly astonishing way. Somebody called it, didn't begin with us, and it doesn't begin with us. You can see very clearly how these patterns started with previous members of the family. And you kind of things, if somebody, for example, has made good, so maybe a few generations ago, somebody was a self-made person, made lots of money doing something, maybe some engineering feat or creating something or building the railways or whatever it happens to be. And and then or purveying alcohol in some way. And then what happens is that the people sacrificed in the making of that fortune inhabit themselves into the children, the descendants. So the children find themselves acting out the sacrifices of the people who were sacrificed in the making of the fortune, because it's very hard to make a fortune without people falling into vats of molten metal, or becoming alcoholics if they were slave owners in Jamaica, or whatever it is. So you find these patterns going down through the family, where the descendants are afflicted in the way that the people at the time were sacrificed in the making of the fortune. And so it's, it's the same with colonialism, and there are all kinds of patterns that I've noticed over the years, which can be resolved in this way. But it doesn't have to be, writ large like that. That's in big families. But even in everyday families, there are always these patterns that come down to us, that this work reveals, and we're able to make good. I was working yesterday online, and one of the people I was working with, one of her, I don't know, her grandparents' families emigrated from one country to another, and she lost her entire family, including a twin, as something like 7 members of her family. And the current mother of the person wanted to have children, but had 7 miscarriages. And so there was a direct correlation between the 7 members of the family that were lost in previous generation with the 7 miscarriages that she prevented her from having a family. So this original person couldn't have a family because they were all lost, and she couldn't have a family because of her miscarriages. So all these kind of patterns come up and are revealed, and it's possible to demonstrate them so beautifully and symmetrically visually, and people can just make good, and these things don't have to continue down the lines.
It's absolutely fascinating work. I've read Mark Wallin's book, It Didn't Start With You, who I think you referenced. Yeah.
When you see these patterns, you see how current generations are reliving the same thing that happened in the previous generation. And so when you can reveal that, and that's the role of me as the guide through this work, then you can dissolve it, and it no longer has to distress the person who's living it out.
Yeah, it also, what comes to mind is how the roots of theatre were ritual, and it feels like that. It feels like a sort of theatrical ritual where the body becomes, or like the dreaming or the traditions with the masks and spirits, where you become other.
Exactly. I think, when people talk about this work, they often talk about acting, but actually, if you do act, the work stops. So it's neither acting nor is it channeling. I've had a lot of people who say they're channels over the years, and that doesn't work either. So it's interesting. It's something very different. But I suspect that acting may have originated in something like this. Originally, I think it's become something very different now, but maybe acting in the beginning was a kind of inhabiting of these people. But I always encourage people not to say they're playing a role, because that definitely stops the work. And the word I use is representing, because, as I say, channeling doesn't work either. It's very mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll have to experience it one day.
And well, come to this face-to-face week in October.
I have seen it. Yeah, it sounds amazing. I mean, there's just so much happening now. I'd love to know, as someone who's been so invested in this work for such a long time, how do you perceive this surgence or emergence of I guess, non-religious spiritual culture? Does it bring you joy? Are there red flags for you?
Yes, being people say they're spiritual but not religious. It's a tricky one, that, because a lot of you get a lot of people making kind of salad, a bit of this, a bit of that, a bit of the other. And then they get the subject of cultural appropriation. But spiritual traditions have always culturally appropriated other ones. I mean, every tradition is embedded in the previous one. I mean, it's just how it works. So I think the wokeness around that is very tricky indeed. I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to say, because at the same time, the materialistic world is fighting back very vigorously. I mean, yes, there's a whole body of people who are deeply interested in the spiritual world, but at the same time are disaffected from their own spiritual roots. And so they don't go to church, say, in England, or they don't participate in the ceremonies of their own tradition. And one of the things about societal religious traditions is that it holds it in place. Whereas, I mean, I see this amongst, the Tibetan Buddhists who have been displaced, and now Tibetan, but since the diaspora of the Tibetans, because of the Chinese, the Tibetans are spread all over the world, and they're teaching their teachings, which they never did before. But at the same time, they don't have the same rigorous upbringing that they had before, and everything is getting very diluted. In the Western world, people take on the forms maybe, but they don't really do the practice. So, whereas the spiritual tradition carried with it the sort of inner workings, and that's being lost. And so people are doing a much sort of vaguer spirit. I just don't know. I don't know what will happen. I don't know how it'll continue. I'm not sure, because these traditions, these societal religious traditions, were the vehicles for the transmission of the spirit, and now people are discarding those and trying to get the core of the tradition, the core of the spiritual practice, without the trappings, which in a way is a good thing, because the trappings are usually pretty awful. But at the same time, how long it can go without being completely dissolved into the rest, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure, but it's very interesting to watch how it works.
Yeah, sort of. I always model it up, but it feels like there's a shift from the etic to the emic, the kind of external sense of a spiritual tradition into the internal experience. I mean, I see that so much with the psychedelic renaissance, this internal experience of altered states of consciousness or expanded states, and that kind of initiates, I think, this curiosity and search for our belonging. I think we're all searching for it, aren't we?
I see that as a very male-oriented thing, this idea of externalizing the means of transformation and then re-imbibing it. I mean, I've been to many, because all my family is sort of involved in that too, in a way, in how it affects everybody. And so I've been to many of these meetings, and I would say they're much more male than female, because I think the idea of externalizing the means of transformation and re-ingesting it is a much more male kind of activity. But there's no question that this has brought about big changes and I think has a lot to do with the spiritual but not religious movement, in a way, because just by ingesting a substance, people are able to inhabit the spiritual world in a way that it was closed off to them, and often not experienced in the religious world either. Because if you're a lot of, say, for example, if you take part in a societal Christian world, it's not very mystical, really. You have to really look quite hard to find the mystical side of it. It's a lot to do with form. Whereas psychedelics have really burst that open. There's no question about that. Yeah.
And there's just a plethora. Everyone who's listening needs to, if they haven't already, go and have a look at your world and work. I'm just thinking of the book series you edited, for example. That's just like such an archive of knowledge and wisdom, and such a beautiful way to do it. And you've mentioned, you've got your in-person immersion coming up in October. Is there anything else you want to share before we close?
I mean, I'm doing a workshop every month online with and I'm alternating. I'm doing a voice workshop, a healing voice workshop 1 month, and a family constellation workshop the next month. They are both so brilliant on Zoom. I mean, I would never have imagined it possible, but they really do work. I mean, this one just gone, because everybody becomes part of everybody else's life, we immediately became a very tight community, and sort of teased out what was going on in these transgenerational patterns, and then as a discursive as a teaching method, the healing voice workshop, I'm able to teach overtone chanting very easily online, almost more easily than in person. The only things I can't do online are my big mandala workshops, which are very, very which involve 4 things happening at once, big groups and chanting in each other's faces, and so that I can't do that. But so people can check my website, which is healingvoice.com, www.healingvoice.com, and scroll down on the homepage, and it will tell them what the next workshops are coming up online. And then for the first time in 4 years, I'll be doing this big a non-residential week intensive in London, in North London, in Hampstead, of family constellations, and that'll be a week. And then I'll probably do a couple of weeks next year in the spring again, in over May Day and over All Souls. I've always done these week-longs over these important times of the year, sort of May Day, which is a very interesting time when there's a sort of penetration of the earth by the heavens, and All Souls Day, when we honor the ancestors, All Souls Day, or All Saints Day, when we honor the sacred dead, the hallowed dead, and All Hallows, and then All Souls Day, when we honor the everybody else. So yes, so there's, and I have CDs, I have recordings, which people can now get online through Bandcamp. They just need to look up Bandcamp and put my name in, and they can get my recordings. One is Overtone Chanting Meditations, which is brilliant for meditation, and the other is the Healing Voice, which is a talk and sound and voice chanting.
And can we have a quick preview of the overtone chanting?
Yeah. I'll do it singly, and then I'll do a recording. And actually, funnily enough, the group was done when we went into lockdown, and so it's actually a family chant. So it's my son Cosmo, my son Merlin, Rupert, myself, and one other person, sort of magnified. So it's a really family. It's an induction into the Sheldrake family.
Wow.
So I'll just do it singly first.
Yeah, so powerful. It feels completely primordial. Just, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's like, people say it's like the music of the spheres.
I love that. Thank you for being here with the Rooted Healing community. Through deepened imagination, consciousness expansion, and cross-cultural wisdom exchange, we explore psychedelic culture, spirituality, and ecology to ignite collective healing. We offer nature-immersive ceremonial gatherings, legal and safe psychedelic-assisted psilocybin retreats, integrative healing courses, and a growing collection of resources rooted in regenerative reciprocity. Visit rootedhealing.org to learn more. Please do consider joining our Patreon community, where you can gift forward and support our work in exchange for bonus material, book and gift giveaways, meditations, workshops, episode transcripts, community discussion, an array of resources from our guests, and discounts to our events. Your monthly contribution, which can be as little as £2 a month, helps us cover the costs of running the show, and our hope is to gather enough abundant gifters to afford professional audio productions so that we can free up more time to focus on gathering together in person, which is the heartbeat of our work. Think of it as buying me a hot chocolate once a month. I'd be very grateful. Our Patreon has such a rich archive already to support you, and you can gain immediate access when signing up. Patreon is an easy-to-use app both on desktop and on mobile, providing a clear space to explore our archive and upcoming gifts. Come follow us on Instagram at Rooted Healing Co, or find us on the various platforms you tune into. And don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe to the show if these stories and conversations are touching you. It's a beautiful act of reciprocity to make those couple of clicks and help others discover our work. The music in this episode was by Mike Howe and Chris Park. Thank you so much for enriching this episode with your creations. If you'd like to gift your music to the Rooted Healing podcast, please reach out to us via the link in the show notes. I'm your host, Veronica Stanwell. Thanks for listening.